Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ikoi, Hero and myself host weekly live discussions. So come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron Hank King.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy. What we're going to talk about is what's happening in the U.S. that we already have 250 mass shootings, a sign of ill health. And by a mass shootings, I should say, mass shooting is a shooting in which the shooter doesn't know the people shot, in which at least 4 people are dead, and there are also wounded people. So that's a jump over last year. And I should mention, after mentioning that there are 250 mass shootings, the year is not even half over yet, so I'm afraid there's more to come. And in addition, there are all sorts of signs of real problems. Shootings are going up, suicides, homicides, intimate partner violence, hate crimes, they're all up. And this is scary for everyone. In addition, 20% of adults experience a mental illness. And I got all these stats on the internet. And if anybody wants them, they can write in, and of course they'll get them. So that's equivalent to 50 million Americans who are stating that they're mentally ill. And there are 5% who are extremely mentally ill, psychotic, dysfunctional, and so on. So what's happening here? As people who care about what's going on around us and look through a psychological lens, we have to see that there is a huge problem and try to understand why. And I think that in America, the basic social contract has been broken. The social contract is that we obey the rules of society, and the society comes through for us. It's supposed to provide opportunities to make a decent living, to save us from destruction, to educate our children, and in the US, to give our children a better future than we had, than we have currently. And we stay within the bounds of what's expected of us as citizens, within the rules, with the promise that our society comes through for us. Well, about 80 to 90% of Americans are unprotected and terrified. It's only the top 10 or 20% that feel okay because they have the money to leave this country if things really go bad, and they have a lot of people to wait on them, and they have excellent health care, and they feel protected. In the US, we have the most COVID deaths of anyone per population, the most in the world. 1 million people have died of COVID. 20 million people have dropped out of the labor force because they just gave up. I mean, when there are studies of why people dropped out, it's mainly because they feel totally devalued and disrespected and underpaid. And that's understandable because the top 4 employers in the US, as our guest Emily Gindelsberger told us, are Walmart, Amazon, the call centers, which people call to get ostensible service or make complaints, and fast food. all those workers are monitored every second on the job and work under terrible, terrible conditions. At Amazon, they walk on average about 11 miles a day. There are free pain meds regularly distributed because they used to have too many people trying to see a nurse or collapsing. So they have free pain meds all around the warehouses so people can disguise the fact that they're pushed at a pace that is terrible for their bodies, a pace of finding items and putting them in conveyor belts to be packaged, and then a pace of packaging and getting ready to send these things. And at Walmart, they also have scanners that rush them so they can't take a break, that measure their time in the bathroom. The same thing in call centers, where places like AT&T have a call center where you call to get a complaint, to have a complaint about getting your service corrected, and where they're instructed and paid much more by saying, well, the problem is you could get a better service, and selling a better service to them, and really don't know how to help them improve their service. And fast food workers who are also monitored every second. They have 3 minutes to assemble a burger and get it to a person, no matter what's going on. And they are scanned and timed and told that they are all replaceable. And the problem is, American workers were told, who are most of the workers providing for us, were told they were essential and then totally devalued. And so they're enraged. One worker at the John Deere strike said it very well. He said, we're told we're essential and we're treated like garbage. We're going out on strike. And they did go out on strike. And everyone seems to know that the promise that each generation will do better than the previous one as long as they're white and in a family headed by a male, and that used to be the majority overwhelmingly. Well, that's not true anymore. And partly it's not true because the corruption of rampant US capitalism means that those people who are supposed to represent our needs and take care of us in Congress and the Senate are basically bought off by huge corporations, and they don't protect us. Figures that brought home to me are that there are 535 Congress people and senators that represent us. As of this year, there are 12,137 registered lobbyists that push the interests of private interest groups. And of course, there's more that don't register. They protect big capitalist corporations. A good example is what's happening with mass murder and homicides and gun laws. 80% of Americans want gun laws passed so that assault weapons are banned and handguns cannot be bought by young people, and that they all have to be registered. But those stringent gun laws haven't happened because the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, NRA, pays off our representatives. 70% of Americans want abortion rights for all Americans. That's not happening either because right-wing Republicans beholden to lobbyists and right-wing Christian lobbyists are pushing our representatives to make it more difficult to have abortions in many states. The overwhelming majority of Americans want the wealthiest people to pay their share. They want a profits tax, an excess profits tax, or some other mechanism that has been tried in the past, like a ban on excess wage demands and profits that Reagan put into place. It was Nixon who put that into place. They want that put into place now. It doesn't happen. The top people made 2 trillion during the pandemic, the top corporations. Most Americans lost money. 50% of them were unemployed at least some of the time. And Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So if they lose even a couple of weeks, they're behind. And so Americans, the overwhelming mass of Americans, feel abandoned and unprotected because they are. Now, mentally healthy Americans are doing what's a healthy thing here. They're joining with other people to protect them. Unions have grown like never before. At the beginning, as one example, at the beginning of the pandemic, Starbucks wasn't unionized. Now there are 100 unions operating within Starbucks. Amazon was never unionized. Now, for the first time, the Amazon Labor Union has organized an Amazon warehouse of more than 8,000 people. All the workers at Grinnell College are unionized. The tech workers at all California and the graduate students at all California universities are unionized. Also, people are joining political groups, socialist groups, Black Lives Matter, gay and lesbian groups, and all sorts of other groups are saying, wait a minute, we can do something about this and we'll keep up our mental health because we're trying for something we can be proud of. Some people are joining right-wing conspiracy theory believers and becoming activated fascists like the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Patriot Front, and others that invaded to try to switch the election results on January 6th in the United States. And others are terrified and turning to violence, to despair, to suicide, to drugs, legal and illegal. And these are all a perfect example of why it's not all just in our heads. Something's happening out there and it has enormous mental health ramifications. And I wondered what questions you have about this, because it isn't really broadcast very much that this is happening, but it certainly is happening. Liam and Ikoi, does that bring up anything for you or any questions?
Well, I think more and more is over the last, I would say, 20 years, I've just seen, just in terms of individual like relationship, wise, socially, just how tenuous things have gotten.
Yeah.
Granted, where I live is kind of, San Diego is somewhat of a transient town in many ways because, we predominantly run on military money, have a huge base, and we have, a couple of major, I think, what was it? Northrop Grumman has a huge campus here. So that's a huge part of our infrastructure. But it's just, in the last 10 years. And I think it's also like, when you're talking about like friendship, a lot of times like moving 30, even like 35, you don't have to move very far. Even
Right.
moving like 35, 40 miles can like
That's
greatly, impact, your ability to like see each other in person. And so it's just been really kind of, in the last 10 years, most people that I've known in San Diego, the majority have moved away. And the majority that moved away from, San Diego didn't stay at like where they moved to from San Diego. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people have to move to chase work.
Yes.
So, and also like, how much people have been, commuting to find affordable rent.
Right.
Which also like takes time away from family and friends. The last time I was in San Francisco, I met one driver that lived in San Francisco.
Right. Right. Because it's too expensive.
Yeah. Most of them actually lived like anywhere from 2 to 4 hours away, and they were commuting. And I'm talking one way.
Wow.
One of the drivers, he said, yeah, his commute to San Francisco is like 4.5 hours on if it's no traffic one way, right?
Wow.
So he would drive to San Francisco and he would just sleep in his car. He had a gym membership where he would take showers. He would just sleep in his car for 2 to 3 days while he does, Uber and Lyft. And then go home, So like those kinds of conditions, predate the pandemic, but the pandemic really, I think,
exaggerated it.
Yeah, exaggerated the hit to the social fabric. So it's one of those things where, I mean, not to, mention what this does to adults, but, what all this, especially like, a lot of people that are moving to chase cheaper rent prices, are moving at a pretty breakneck speed.
Yeah, because rents are going up at a pretty breakneck speed and they're not regulated. I live in New York City, and our sold out mayor is allowing his board to raise regulated rents, not even market rents, but supposedly stabilized rents and rent control apartments to go up 2 to 4% when people owe on average $200,000 in back rent and are in danger of being evicted. So it's a disaster. And I think the pandemic, as you say, has certainly increased that, because Robin Dunbar, he used to be the head of a division at Oxford on and the social anthropology and psychological anthropology, and he says that friendship is dependent on geographic accessibility. And so that's just, and that's one of the things that sustains people, connection with other people that they can see, that they can cry on, that they can hug. And that's been terribly disrupted. That's an important point. And I think that Americans feel deserted because they have been, by and large. The big money has taken over and they feel so lost. And you work in the world of addiction. I'm sure you've seen that exaggerated. How has it worked in terms of addiction?
Addiction, is less about the drug. It's about, your how you've grew
Personal.
up and your environment, your family, your relationships. But the pandemic has really we have a record overdose rate now. The supply is street supply has never been safe.
No.
But the amount of drugs that are in people that are thinking they're buying heroin, now they're probably buying like 16 different all kinds of things, including fentanyl, and mixed in there. But it's not just necessarily fentanyl, because oftentimes you see benzodiazepines in there that isn't reversible through Narcan, right? Things like that, or you find like fentanyl in uppers, like cocaine and meth.
Wow. And we should say that fentanyl was originally an elephant tranquilizer, which has now
that's
been
carfentanil.
introduced.
No, that's carfentanil. Fentanyl was not an elephant tranquilizer per se.
What was it used before?
Fentanyl is still used. Fentanyl is actually an incredibly important opioid in medication. In it's often used in surgery. It's often used in like post-surgical recovery. Fentanyl is pretty effective for some of the breakthrough pain with cancer, things like that. Fentanyl is legitimate medication. I can't stress that enough, because one of the things about the opioid epidemic has really kind of tainted, opioids as the legitimate medicine that it is.
They say that so many overdose deaths are due to fentanyl.
Right.
How do you see that?
Well, because, it's one of those things where, to a certain degree, one aspect is, one of the iron laws of prohibition, right? So generally speaking, you make, you restrict and criminalize certain substances. The tendency is that it's always going to be stronger as a result of the prohibition. Part of that is because, concentrated doses are much easier to smuggle.
Yeah.
Right. It's also one of those things where, there are people that seek out fentanyl because it is stronger. They have the tolerance for it. But I think it's one of those things where, again, much like, a dysfunctional society, we do have an extraordinarily dysfunctional supply system.
Yes, we do. And we do have, the U.S. empire is falling. We've lost the last 4 wars. We're sending billions to Ukraine as a geopolitical strategy against the Russia-China alliance, which means that people are complaining, at least in New York, there's groups that are protesting that why are we sending billions there? We need them. People need help. And in New York, it's more visible because there's more people living on the street who have been evicted.
San Diego has a pretty, Los Angeles has an extremely intense, San Francisco as well, homeless issue. It's also very visible in San Diego. It's not nearly as intense as it is in, say, Tenderloin in San Francisco.
I had a conversation recently with someone who basically said that they thought people who were drug users or obese, so I'm not quite sure how those two things fit together, lol, it was their fault. They made bad choices. And so that's the cultural thing we're up against. So all those homeless people in the cities you just mentioned, it's that they made just bad choices. It's their fault.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important thing. Sorry, Liam.
It's just one of those things of, I think we are taught to think about ourselves and our own achievements, and we're not sort of taught to think bigger than that. That's what we're supposed to focus on. And then I also think that, a lot of this, all the scary stuff that you've been talking about, Harriet, the thing about it is that it also adds fuel to the fire about maintaining your class position, because you're like, I don't want to end up like that.
Right.
So I'm going to double down and help the machine because I don't want to be like that. So it's like there's a sort of real catch-22 to all of it.
Right.
Again, sort of the individual responses are bleak. Like I shared this post on Reddit that was on one of the other subreddits. The person had said, life is mostly doing things you don't want to do until you die. How do most people deal with that? And one of the high voted comments was, I take drugs every day.
Yeah.
So again, taking drugs is a perfectly reasonable response to a situation where you have no hope.
Yes, It is. But it's also important because the idea of bad choices, is it a bad choice that the educational system is so poor in poor areas and that private schools haven't had the lapses in education that public schools have? Is that an individual bad choice that you lost your job? That's the employer's choice based on profit alone. And I think Americans are unaware that in Europe, in other countries like Germany and France and the Scandinavian countries, people are paid by the employer is paid between 70 and 90% of the salary, but the employer has to take that worker back at the end of the pandemic. And so people aren't suffering equivalently. And that's a governmental choice. It's not a personal choice. And one of the ways that they get people to take abuse is to pretend it's an individual choice rather than a social problem. And I think that accounts for all of these terribly sad things in the United States, but also the positive ones. People are unionizing in a way that they haven't since the 1930s. And they're also joining political groups in a way that they haven't since the 1930s. Because some people are saying, wait a minute, it's not only a bad choice here. I didn't have those choices. We need to change our choices, and we won't have the power alone. We need each other. And then they connect and overwhelm some of the things that Ikoi was talking about, their isolation and hopelessness that you were mentioning, because you work together, you can change things. Like the woman at Starbucks, I mean, their employer told them that they will never be able to organize. Because they're all separate Starbucks, they've organized 100 stores. And Amazon told its workers they'd never be able to unionize. They unionized. People are beginning to say, yes, we can, which is a positive attitude. And not this individualist solution, because of course every isolated person can't change a situation which is a social situation. And if you have the best democracy money can buy, then those with the most money will buy your democracy. And there are people working against that and working for a more equitable America. But it really is a time where either you go into despair or take drugs or die or do something violent or join with others to change. It's really a moment of truth, I think. Do you think so?
Well, I also wonder, like, why is it just that we weren't taught in school how to think systemically? You know, and a huge part of school, at least my schooling, is very much about your grades. You know, it's not about your other classmates. It's about what you do. So from the offset, are we just not taught to think about things in a sort of systemic way? And or is it just that because feelings are individually centered and they feel like they come from inside, that it seems natural that you would blame yourself for XYZ situation? And
well, I think we're trained that way. I really do. I remember in high school, the utopias we read. And then now that I'm grown up, I asked people, what utopias did you read in high school? Everyone read books like 1984, Animal Farm, Brave New World. Every attempt they read about a utopia failed. People worked together to make something good. It failed and it was worse. And I think those are lessons we learn. And we don't learn about successful revolutions, except the American Revolution, where we only learn very altered versions. And so I think it's the school systems and it's the culture. I mean, I didn't ever hear that American settlers, that over half of them were bondsmen and women, which were people that were transported and then had to work 7 years without pay for the payment of their bond, and they could be bought and sold. And if they ran away before the bond was paid off, they were then punished with more servitude. That I didn't realize that they emptied the jails, and that's who came to Georgia. I mean, all we heard about was the Puritans driven by religious fervor. And we didn't learn how they then killed Anne Hutchinson, who wanted to be a woman preaching or who wanted to preach a little differently. We didn't learn how horrible they were to their children, that when their kids were captured by Native Americans, they didn't want to be rescued. We didn't learn anything except this canned crap about noble Americans conquering the West, not murdering over 1 million Native Americans. So we get a skewed idea of reality. I don't know if it's that way in England. Sorry,
I do think nationalism is something all nations kind of, inoculate through their history and social studies classes. I don't think America's necessarily that egregious in that aspect there of showing a very, very skewed and slanted history in schools.
Mhm.
I think that's kind of a universal nationalism building.
You have to teach abstraction though, don't you? Because what does it actually mean? Like, so I'm British, but like, what is that? Like, in theory, it's that I have more in common with the people on this island than anywhere else, or something like that.
Right.
So that sort of shared sense of shared identity, that can be important, I guess. But what does it actually mean? It's, again, I guess maybe this all falls under the category of statecraft. But the idea that people grow up with the nationality as part of their identity is, to my mind, an often unquestioned abstraction that that can be taken as given. But it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, what does being American mean to either of you?
Well, one of the things that I was impressed about is two things. Well, one was in Germany, when I spent time there and studied that, they really have come to term with their fascist heritage. There are big exhibits at the Natural History Museum, what happened to create fascism in Germany. And in schools, they've taken it on, what happened. And they've done a lot about changing the child rearing practices that allowed people to be fascists, that kind of harsh disregard of children's feelings and needs. Because a lot of the things they insulted Jews with, like Leistbub, baby covered with lice, contemptible thing, were what they called Jews and other political prisoners, homosexuals, leftists. And so I think some countries do something more than others. And certainly that contributes to a national identity that's built on stuff that doesn't mean anything, as you said. What is it? What is being American? Is it having a real democracy? Is it the people who struggled in unions to have fair conditions? You don't really learn that in school. And that's a real problem that would be corrected in an honest society, I think.
Right. Well, a lot of times I think, I think improvements that happened in Germany as well as Japan only happened because they lost the war.
Mm-hmm.
If they didn't lose the war, I think it would be a very different story.
Yes, it probably would. Although the United States has lost 4 wars. They weren't as big, but they're not huge.
But they also, well, a huge thing, though, that is very typical of modern American wars is that they're not fought on American soil.
No, they're not. So people don't know what war is here.
Right. Versus World War II, was mostly when it came to places like Germany and Japan, there was, active, consistent fighting on home soil.
Right. And in Russia, they lost 30 million people died, and they're very aware of that.
Right. So they had the most losses, I believe, in terms of numbers of people.
Yes, the Russians.
Right?
Yeah,
the
Russians. Because they fought hand-to-hand combat against the Nazis in the streets. It was ferocious.
But generally, the purpose of nationalism has, I think, if we're going to generalize, has always been our country is better than other countries.
Yeah. Team America, world police.
Right. Is our culture is more superior to other cultures, that is kind of the inoculation, I think, of generalized nationalism.
That's Trump, the greatest, make America great again, right?
Right.
Yeah. In these abstractions, then, what are the positives in terms of how you personally identify as American? What are the sort of, you've spoken there about Germany sort of reckoning with itself on a national level, and that having some benefits because then you don't breed the same problem again and again. So in that is a sort of positive example of nationalism, maybe.
Right.
So do either of you have a sort of particular thing that you're just like,
Yes.
this is actually one of the good things about America,
Yes, it is. And actually, I think of this movie that was made by Earl Robinson and Waldo Salt called What is America to Me? And it talks about diversity and it talks about hope. And both of those people were blacklisted during McCarthy era. So their films aren't seen very much. But it was very inspiring to me as a child. It said, what is America to me? A name, a flag, or a statue I see, and it talks about America's hope, America's connection between diverse people. And right now in America, some Americans are trying to deal with slavery, whereas with critical race theory, whereas others are the right wing is trying to ban the books that do that and call slavery Black immigration to the United States. So those things are being fought out in the United States now. And what was America? Because of course America was very different if you were Black or a slave. Even with the Constitution, with liberty and justice for all, 9 of the people had slaves who signed that Constitution, including the president and then the vice president and the next president. So that there are these contradictions. And I think some Americans are trying to bring up the contradictions and others are trying to absolutely squash that. Is that your experience in Japan, Ikoi, or yours in England, Liam?
I mean, I really don't know enough. I think that in general, lol. I think that the current Conservative government, I think they just they sort of took a leaf out of Trump's book and shitpost basically.
Yeah.
They wanted to bring imperial measurements back in school. That was the big thing the other week, and I just think it's all just it's all just fluff to distract everyone or shape conversations or all that kind of stuff. But yeah, certainly, I mean, there's definitely the old guard who would like to think of all these slave traders as somehow important great men that deserve statues. And places like in Bristol where they threw one of the statues in the river in protest is well, there you go, there's people's power. But yeah,
what are imperial measurements?
Inches, right? Instead of millimeters and centimeters, everything would be back in inches.
Right.
And ounces, is that right?
Yeah,
ounces and pounds, right. Yeah.
But anyway, Ikoi, I don't know what your sort of thoughts on all that stuff is.
Well, I mean, Japan has definite areas of, relatively xenophobic country in many ways, right?
Yes.
A lot of, I think, a lot of historical revisioning in terms of, teaching the history. And so some commonalities there with the United States. But yeah, I mean, I didn't spend, I spent the first 5 years of my life there. And then I used to go back for summers. So I'm not as, well versed in what's going on there as I am here. Although it's really funny because although I spent most of my life here, I still don't necessarily identify as an American.
Yeah, I can understand that because immigrants often don't identify as American because it's hard to. My husband's parents were German refugees from Nazi Germany, and he always felt a little removed because his parents were German. And also because even though they were refugees from the Nazis, they believed in German culture. And they believed that fascism could happen anywhere. But I grew up feeling very hopeful because I grew up when America, I'm old. America won World War II. Every other economy was smashed. We were the top of the world, undisputed, because nobody else could compete, because every other industrial economy was destroyed. And I had the sense of endless possibility because I'm white, less because I'm a woman, but of all sorts of possibilities and openings, which now aren't there for Americans. And the UN started, and we sang about it in school in a very hopeful way for world peace. It was a different America. And that shaped what I think America is. Very differently from, let's say, what my daughter feels.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what do you think to this? Bullies win. So you have to bully, you have to be a bully about the right things.
Well, I think bullies win unless all the people that are not as physically strong as the bully get together and smash that bully. And that's happened throughout history. And I think it's happening in the union movement in the United States. One of the things that made Schultz, who was the head of Starbucks and then came back, one of the things that helped other Starbucks unionize is that Schultz made a big statement after an employee accused Schultz of firing her because she was active in the union. He said, I would never do such a thing, and I support unions. But she was smart enough to tape his firing her for her union activism and played it all over the media. And that inspired others, so that from one Starbucks striking in Buffalo, there are now 100 all over the place. And I think what happens is people say, hey, you stand up to the bully, you can win if you get together.
Right. Well, I mean, it's also like, who gets labeled a bully is
right.
Dependent on who is talking, right?
That's right.
Unions have often been labeled a bully in a lot of American discourse for a long time.
Yeah, corporations would feel that way.
Yeah.
The people that are trying to get a better wage or better working conditions. And if the corporations own the media, we should point out Jeff Bezos of Amazon owns the Washington Post, and Murdoch owns the New York Post, and I forget who owns the New York Times, but it's another large corporation. And so it's not like the kind of censorship that they had in Russia's central government, but you need the ads to keep your newspaper going. So you make sure that you have stories that don't contradict A, the ads that you need, and B, the State Department access that you need to get the news. So it all gets compromised. And those who are bullied don't get into the front pages as much or on TV. So it's kind of word of mouth. But I'm amazed at the amount of unionizing in the United States. Sarah Nelson, the heroic head of the American Flight Attendants Union, said they can't keep up with it. She's urging the AFL-CIO to get more active. There are more unions forming than anyone ever saw in their lifetime, because people are realizing we're bullied. We may be told we're valuable, but we're not paid. And we're treated badly. And they tell us we're replaceable. And so there are these different conversations going on here now.
There are different conversations going on, but union membership did decline to an all-time low in 2021.
Mhm.
So, and I think there is a lot of issues that need to be hashed out within like some of the larger unions.
Yes, particularly
Too.
the AFL-CIO unions that weren't being militantly aggressive about getting better wages.
Right.
So what's happening is all these unions that are unaffiliated and not counted by the AFL, and recently the most popular are the Starbucks union and the union at Amazon are still unions. And the ones at all the colleges and are unions. They're just not within the aegis of organized labor, which had kind of sold out.
Yeah. It's become like admin heavy,
Yes,
top heavy,
very top heavy.
Yeah.
I know that also what happened was when they went along and kicked the leftists out of the unions during the McCarthy era, they really kicked out the spark. Whereas in Germany, the Marshall Plan required that they not allow anyone who's a communist to teach at the university. They all went into the labor movement. They have an incredibly militant labor union movement. They have a 22-hour work week for the metal workers at the same pay so they could have time-life balance and all these other things, because the United States was set back terribly with the anti-communist crusades, which were possible in an America that was victorious after World War II, where, you didn't feel you needed the left to stand up for you. And that's changing now. But I think it is a really pivotal time here because people are in terrible shape. And it's pivotal time because we have to see what people do, whether they drug themselves, whether they kill themselves and each other, whether they join unions and political groups to empower themselves together. These are huge. It's a huge time of change. And it's not all in people's heads either. It's out there.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Bilmus, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.